The queen stepped down from her biolattice throne like someone shedding armor. And when Aelara's gaze found him, Javier felt every bolt of the salvage bay tighten in his chest. The words were soft, alien, and precise in the humid, metal-scented air. Quiero tener un hijo tuyo. For one ridiculous, suspended second, he thought it was a joke. Then the translation coil on his collar blinked and confirmed it. The Queen of Lissari had just told a grease-streaked mechanic from Tierra that she wanted his child. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. He heard the clatter of tools fall to the deck behind him, metal on metal that sounded too loud in the hush that followed. In the ring of engineers and dignitaries, someone whispered protocol. Another voice fluted out the Confederation phrase for impossible. And Javier's name felt suddenly like a brand. He stood with his hands still on the propulsion panel he had been coaxing into purring, palms black where oil met skin, the tips of his fingers raw from a week of welding microfilaments. He had come to Lissari Station to stabilize a decaying core. Old tech, exotic materials, a salvage ticket that promised a tidy payout, and maybe, in some quiet future, a home repair for his sister's broken roof back in Sol 3. He had not come to be an answer to a sovereign's private plea. Aelara was not what the briefing images had suggested. Pictures flattened the peculiar grace of Lissari anatomy into statistics and ceremonial robes. Here, live and immense, she carried the lightness of her people's planet, pale bioluminescence threaded into skin, hair like drifting kelp that moved on its own in the recycled air, eyes like twin moons rimmed with a color Javier's translator called aural. She moved as if sound was an afterthought. When she spoke, the words were brushed into the air, and somehow, shockingly, they landed in Javier's chest. She had stepped down from a throne that seemed grown rather than built, interlocking living latticework that pulsed faintly, feeding off station systems and the court's quiet incense. For a woman whose decisions shaped orbits, she had chosen, in that moment, to be nearer to a man whose greatest command was over spanners and flux regulators. The counselors around her stiffened. Advisors in layered silks muttered about lineage and duty. A minister with the emblem of the Conservancy on his lapel gave Javier the sort of look reserved for dangerous insects. The Lissari had survived for eons through rituals of pairing, careful, regulated couplings to preserve their genome's luminous cadence. And Aelara's line was the axis of that survival. For her to abdicate, or even to flirt with the idea of a hybrid child born without approval from the council, was scandal embroidered with consequence. Yet her face held no spite, no political theater, only a vulnerability that made Javier's breath catch. There was urgency threaded through her plea, a marrow-deep longing that belonged to someone who had catalogued all the correct alliances and found them wanting. "Why me?" Javier asked before he could stop himself. His voice felt too coarse, too small beneath the vaulted dome of Lissari diplomacy. Aelara tilted her head, a movement like a tide. "Because you are not a diplomat," she said. "Because your hands fix things meant to die. And because when I watched you with the core, you did not plead its pedigree or your status. You touched brokenness like a promise." Her words were intimate but not flirtatious. She spoke with a queen's economy, but her eyes were curious in a way accorded to young scholars or newborn things. Because the council fears what loyalty to ancestry cannot guarantee. Because sometimes survival requires risk. Around them, the salvage team shifted uncomfortably, Javier's crew boss, Reina, looked ready to explode. Part protective friend, part incredulous accomplice in a truth she couldn't yet process. She had dragged Javier onto the mission. She had signed off on his clearance. What she had not signed up for was the possibility of governmental eyes now studying their mechanic for suitability in a royal genetic line. Javier swallowed. His life had been small betrayals and small mercies. Skipping rent to buy a used diagnostic rig, letting a girlfriend go with the promise he would call when work never allowed it, turning down a job in an orbital scrap ring because his sister needed him. To have a monarch request a child of him made his past look like a collection of insufficient offerings. If this was politics, the price might be his family's safety, his sister's roof, his sister herself. If it was flesh, if Aylara meant what she said, then it was an intimacy he had never imagined being asked to share with anyone, let alone someone whose crown probably weighed enough to bend the light. The station's head advisor, a man named Varun with a clipped human accent and a reputation for savaging headlines. "Your Majesty," he said in perfect Lysari, the translator smoothing his gall. "This is irregular. We are here on salvage terms." He folded his hands like a person holding back a storm. "Authorization does not extend to the politics of my womb." Ayalara's laughter was quiet and small. It did not scatter the room, but landed on the deck like a petal. "No, Varun, those authorizations do not extend to the desires of a sovereign." She turned back to Javier. "Do you fear me, Javier of Tierra? Or do you fear what your people will do if they discover that their mechanic has become part of a royal experiment?" He heard the bitterness in his own words and tasted metal on his tongue. "I don't even know if I can have a child." Aylara's expression softened with an intimacy that felt uncomfortably tender. "Your body is negotiable," she said. "What I ask is no less than a vote against fear. The Lasari cannot continue to sow themselves into smaller and smaller circles. We keep our blood pure, and our world shrinks around us." She settled onto a nearby bench like a person who had been carrying an ache too long to balance. "I have argued with my council for seasons. They fear dilution. They fear weakness. But the world spins with other kinds of strength. Resilience, surprise, the kind of stubbornness you display when you coax life back into failing things." He found himself smiling involuntarily at that description, as if he were a creature of stubbornness. It was ridiculous. He should have been outraged. Instead, a warm, ridiculous part of him wanted to prove to this luminous queen that he could be more than a tool, that the nicked and rusted parts of him still had worth. "Your Majesty," Reina said, straightening, "we are on a timeline. The core's leakage will destabilize the orbital path if we don't reroute the flux matrix by cycle end. We can talk." "We will talk," Aylara interrupted. And the finality in her voice was like a lock closing. "But not in the listening rooms. Not where ministers can eavesdrop and carry our words like trophies. Tonight, after you have sealed the core, I will come to the gardens. I will bring food grown in my own soil. Speak then, Javier. Tell me your reasons." It was an order wrapped in invitation. It was dangerous in a way that made Javier's palms prickle. The salvage work consumed the day like a patient machine. Engines hummed, clamps bit into composite plating, and Javier's hands moved on instinct, measuring, adjusting, whispering apologies to the vanishing architecture beneath his fingers. The core did not thank him. It simply obeyed impulses, an animal answering a steadying voice. Around him, Lysari technicians watched with a curious deference. Humans had a reputation for improvisation, for managing breakdowns with duct tape and song. Here, improvisation was both admired and suspected. When the job was done, stabilizers engaged, emergency vents sealed, a temporary lattice grafted, the station breathed out a sigh of relief. Aylara's attendants applauded, a ritualized clap that meant safety and favor. Javier felt the applause like a rain that soaked him to the bone. He should have been elated. Instead, an undercurrent of dread pulled at the base of his skull. The moment in the gardens waited like a hinge. That night, Lysari Station's gardens were a rumor of oceans and moss. Bioluminescent vines drifted overhead, their glow cool and merciful. Alara sat alone on a bench carved from living lattice, her robes pooling like liquid moonlight. She had chosen human food, a simple stew of root and spice, and her hands were steady as she offered him a bowl. There was no pageantry in the way she ate, no regality in the way she folded her legs. She was, in the low light, an elegant thing made of loneliness. "I should tell you that a queen proposing such a thing is unprecedented," she said. "My council will call it hubris. Your confederation will call it opportunity. Your agencies will call it asset acquisition. None of that is what compels me." "What does compel you?" he asked, voice too soft for the plants that watched. She studied him as if cataloging a subtle fracture. "We are older than your maps remember," she said. "We have watched stars burn out and worlds close their borders. The Lysari have learned to prioritize survivability over novelty. But survival can calcify into fear. I want something messy, Javier. I want the uncontrollable." He thought of messy things. His sister's laugh, a girlfriend who had left when Javier could not promise more than presence, the grease under his nails that no amount of scrubbing removed. All of those small, imperfect things pulsed under his skin like secret stars. "Why me?" he repeated, but softer now, not needing an answer that would satisfy anyone but himself. Alara's thumb traced the rim of his bowl. "Because the Confederation lists you as salvageable and not remarkable," she said. "Because your record is thin and therefore unencumbered by agendas. Because you do not belong to the councils that legislate unions. Because I think you will teach my people how to live with their broken things rather than bury them." It was an idea so pure and irrational that Javier, against better sense, found it tender. To be chosen not because of pedigree, but because someone thought his particular shape of fault and repair might breed something new. Still, the seed of doubt had roots. "And if they come," he said, "and my family is threatened, if my sister is taken as leverage, I don't have power, Alara. I'm a mechanic, not a negotiator." "You will not be alone," she promised, and the words were soft and absolute. "I will stand between your people and those who would harm them. That is my vow as queen." Javier swallowed. Promises had been cheap in his world, tossed around like the bands of scrap he salvaged. But the sincerity in Alara's voice made him imagine a different kind of currency, one paid in risk. Outside the bubble of the gardens, the galaxy churned with indifference. Bureaucrats returning to their dossiers, human agents lining up their phones to a network none of them would call public. The plan to stabilize the core had been straightforward. The consequences were anything but. In a few heartbeats, a queen's intimate plea had braided his life to something grander, more dangerous, and achingly beautiful. He had always fixed engines on the assumption they could be made whole again. Now, for the first time, someone wanted him to be part of making life that had never been planned, an act that might save a species or ignite a war. "Tomorrow," he said finally, "we decide what kind of danger we're willing to be." Elara's smile was a comet, brief, bright, and leaving a tail of warmth. "We decide what kind of love we're willing to be." He wanted to believe her. He wanted, fiercely and guiltily, to believe the ache in his chest might be the beginning of something that bent space and duty and the old rules into a different shape. The garden smelled of growth and of rain. Above them, Lysari Station blinked like an eye, watching. The night after the gardens felt like a live wire under Javier's skin. He slept in bursts, dreams of valves closing and hands he couldn't see, cradling a small, luminous thing. Each shift at the salvage bay unspooled those fragments. A bolt tightened, a coolant gauge nudged, his fingers moving with the muscle memory of a life built on making broken things keep breathing. But the memory of Ellery's thumb on the rim of that bowl kept returning, an imprint of gentleness that did not belong to any of the cynical, hurried choices he'd ever made. He should have told someone, Reina first, then his sister, then the little radio that still dutifully picked up calls from Soul 3. Instead, he carried the secret like a heat source in his mouth, tasting it when he worked and swallowing any hotness that rose. Reina watched him with a new, tutored suspicion. Her glance cataloged his pauses, the way he answered questions with more androgynous care. "You look like a man who's been offered a ship and is afraid of losing the anchor," she said finally, in the narrow corridor between the reactor control and the crew lounge. Her voice was casual but precise. "Are you in or out? If I say I need time, will you?" He stopped because he didn't want to ask Reina to coddle him into a political scandal. She had enough to do keeping her team intact when corporate and council buzzed like mosquitoes. Reina's hands were steady on his shoulder, a pressure that felt like a human benediction. "Look," she said, "if you say yes to Alara, you sign a contract with a whole species' attention. If you say no, someone else will say yes. Either way, we're fingerprints on something that will get printed in other people's hands. Decide for reasons that don't involve guilt or bravado." He had never been a man of manifest destiny. His dreams were practical, small, repair shops with a steady trickle of customers, his sister's roof fixed with proper bolts, a weekend off where no comms pinged his pocket. Now he was a hinge between species, a possible seed for genetic policy and propaganda. The scale made him sick and a little ridiculous. Still, it terrified him less than the image of his sister in the crosshairs of diplomats. By midday, Lysari Station hummed with a new subterranean current. Varen's presence was like an oil slick, slippery, unavoidable. He had taken to lingering near workstations, smiling with teeth that looked too sharp for human politics, and offering Javier advice about precedents, consequences, and the optics of consent. Varen's thin-lipped counsel smelled of protocol and preserved power. "The Confederation admires audacity," he said once, leaning in until his breath smelled faintly of the garden's herbs. "But audacity unmoored from strategy invites ruin. You must understand the social calculus of your action." "Do you ever speak without a spreadsheet?" Javier asked once too bluntly, and Varen's smile slit into something colder. "Some of us calculate so others can love without fear, Senor," Varun replied. "Do not be sentimental to the point of self-sabotage." That insult settled like dust in Javier's chest. He had always been sentimental in the wrong company. Sentiment had been the reason he'd left jobs, forgiven slights, and stayed late to solder an engine that others would scrap. It had also been the reason he still had a sister who called him at odd hours to sing the news of her days like a small weather report. Varun's words were an attempt to corral love into ledger entries. Alara's earlier refusal of that ledger felt like the only honest thing in a room full of accounting. That evening, Alara insisted upon an inspection tour of the parts supply. She moved like a person who had been taught to examine the world as a map of capacities and failures. When she followed Javier into the storage bays, the contrast between royal and grease was ludicrous and tender. Her kelp-like hair floated in the filtered air, her robes protected from particulate, yet she crouched with a curious dexterity to peer at a crate of microtubes. "You keep your things well," she observed, and Javier felt a pride in the cleaning that had once earned him 2 free breakfasts at a diner near Dock Mine. "Everything gets judged by how it performs," he said. "If it doesn't, I find out why until it does." Her fingers closed on a frayed belt and tested its tensile memory. "You tell stories to them?" she asked. "Sometimes," he admitted. "They don't talk back, but they don't betray me either." "You should tell your sister that," she said. And there was a note in her voice that did not belong to any manual, something like envy. Those who repair become familiar with truth. We preen our rituals until truth hides. They worked together in spans of focused silence, occasionally brushing hands when tightening a fastener. And each time, Javier felt a small electric consequence, as if every touch rewired a private section of him. It was physically precarious. The station's maintenance bays were not built for courtship, but it felt less foolish than any other place Alara could have chosen to learn him. As they worked, Alara asked about Tierra in ways that had nothing to do with diplomacy and everything to do with curiosity. She wanted to know whether his sister sang in the mornings, whether Javier had regrets that he kept like old tools in the back of his mind, whether he believed in the kind of love that could stretch across a star map and still keep a person human. Javier's answers were often clumsy, raw as uncured metal, but she listened like a person taking notes, not for a treaty, but for the sake of seeing him fully. "You like to make things live again," she observed at one point, the observation a soft, true thing. "Do you ever fear the life you create will be claimed by others?" He chewed the inside of his cheek and thought of corporate letters and bureaucratic hands. "All the time," he admitted. "But the alternative is to do nothing because your action could be stolen. That means nothing gets fixed." "It is the same in the palace," Alara said quietly. "There is safety in inertia, but there is no growth. I ask the council to permit a child that may be neither purely Lysari nor purely human. They call it contamination." "They call it war on a page," Javier said. He pictured committee rooms and people in careful suits cutting up words like meat. "And you think it's worth the fight?" "I think it is worth the cost of being honest with our future," Alara said. "I would rather be deposed for love than remain queen for fear." Her words were heroic and reckless, and in their recklessness, somehow sane. Javier wanted to believe in the righteousness of her rebellion, because it made his own small rebellions, leaving when he should have stayed, stealing a night of rest for a job, feel less like cowardice and more like preparation. Their proximity made other things harder. Varun's eyes seemed to find them wherever they went, and rumors specialized into weaponized whispers. A data snap of a private conversation leaked to a Lysari feed, suggesting that the Queen planned to create a hybrid arbiter, circulated with an accompanying editorial about genetic impurity. "They call it war on a page," Javier said. He pictured committee rooms and people in careful suits cutting up words like meat. "And you think it's worth the fight?" "I think it is worth the cost of being honest with our future," Alara said. "I would rather be deposed for love than remain queen for fear." Her words were heroic and reckless, and in their recklessness, somehow sane. Javier wanted to believe in the righteousness of her rebellion, because it made his own small rebellions, leaving when he should have stayed, stealing a night of rest for a job, feel less like cowardice and more like preparation. Their proximity made other things harder. Varun's eyes seemed to find them wherever they went, and rumors specialized into weaponized whispers. A data snap of a private conversation leaked to a Lysari feed, suggesting that the Queen planned to create a hybrid arbiter, circulated with an accompanying editorial about genetic impurity. The council responded with a public statement praising Alara's commitment to tradition, while privately convening emergency sessions to discuss guardrails. On Terra, Javier's situation had harvested attention from an agency whose scope and ethics were contained only by the length of its budget. An operative named Hale reached out with a formal invitation that read more like a summons. He presented it below deck, in a place where the station's snagged on the words. "We are intrigued by your opportunity," Hale said, fingers tapping a data slate. "The Confederation believes in cooperative ventures, but you must understand our concerns. Hybrids could be destabilizing." "You mean weaponizable," Javier said. Hale's face was polite and unreadable. "We mean strategically valuable. We would like to ensure that your choices do not become an unmediated experiment." "Or an unregistered asset," Varun added dryly from the shadow of a strut. Alara, when told of the agency's maneuvers, did not flinch. She expected bureaucracy. What surprised her was the way the cabal of conservancy played their anxieties like a practiced instrument. "They would prefer to keep us docile," she observed. "They will pitch safety as the currency of compliance." "Will you let them?" Javier asked. He could envision the scene that would follow. His consent recast as complicity. Some agency installing monitoring implants under the guise of medical care. Reina and his crew pushed into uncomfortable loyalties. Alara's hand found his when the question left her mouth. The touch was brief and grounding. "I will not allow anyone to take from you under the pretense of protection," she said. "But I also will not let our child be born into secrecy. If we move forward on a stage where transparency can be our armor." Javier laughed, a short burst that tasted like fear. Transparency is a generous word for a shield. Agencies and councils don't love transparency. They weaponize it into oversight. "Then we will need allies," she replied. "People who will see a child as a new citizen, not a trophy. We will need your voice, and I will need to make my proclamation in a way that cannot be ignored." He thought of his sister listening to the news, and of Rena's steady face, and of the small things that made him a man more at home in a metal-strewn bay than a palace. "I don't have a voice that travels galaxies." His admission was a stone placed gently between them. "Not yet," Alara said. "But you have integrity. The exposure of a working heart, literal or political, does more to change minds than 100 speeches." When she said it, Javier felt something in him shift, an easing, like a valve that had held pressure for too long. He was not, perhaps, a senator or a general, but he could testify to the humanness of his choices. He could show the world the small, patient labor of repair as a kind of love. He could tell stories about his sister and the nights they spent repairing radios to hear distant storms. He could be the ordinary face of an extraordinary act. "Allies," he echoed. "Who will stand with us?" Alara's smile was the faint arc of moonlight he had begun to love. "You will have my house," she said. "You will have Reina if she chooses. I will speak to the diaspora of Lysari thinkers who have long argued for renewal. Some humans will be fearful and some will be radical, but there will be enough compassion in both of our peoples to make a beginning." The beginning felt like an impossible thing to carry. Yet when Alara leaned her forehead to his in a moment of quiet, Javier tasted salt. Not fear, but an old, luminous tenderness that had the weight of truth. He thought then of the ways in which broken things became crucibles. In the pressure and heat and careful turning, under hands that refused to abandon them, something new could emerge. Outside, the station's lights cycled. Inside, alliances were drafted in ellipses of compromise and hope. They would need strategy, lawyers, sympathetic scientists, and the courage to make their act a public thing rather than a whispered scandal. The next steps required paperwork and protest, a public engagement plan that could translate this personal rebellion into a political movement. It demanded the terrifying honesty of being seen. The danger, agencies, councils, the calculi of ancestry hung at the edges like storm clouds. But so did the possibility. For Javier, the act of stepping into uncertainty was no longer merely about repairing an engine or promising a roof. It was about deciding whether the life he knew, small and battered, could be the seed of something larger. For Alar, it was about choosing a path that might unmake her crown and remake her world. "Tomorrow," she said, fingers laced with his, "we start a file that will not be about my womb alone. It will be about the kind of citizenship we want for what comes next." He wondered if he was ready for the kind of life that would make his sister proud and his enemies wary. He wondered whether the station's lights were the last he would ever sleep under or the first herald of a new orbit. Above them, the stars continued with their ancient, indifferent patience. Between them, a fragile new intention flickered, tentative, dangerous, and utterly alive. The leak hit like a pressure drop. Slow at first, an odd skip in a feed. Then a siphon of rumor that flooded every channel faster than any sealant Javier had ever set. A clip of Alara laughing with him in the parts bay. A private moment, the kind of careless smile a queen allows only in the dark, became a morning headline on Lysari nets with a venomous subheading. "Sovereign seen courting human mechanic. Genetic implications unchecked." The story bloomed into dossiers and analyses and opinion pieces that did not bother with nuance. In the corridors of the station, whispers hardened into accusations. Javier woke to the sound of his comms pinging in an anxious, aggressive rhythm. Varun's staff was already outside his berth, scanning faces with a patience that meant they had been briefed. Reina burst into the room like a storm, coat flapping, eyes bright with a panic Javier had never seen in her. "They've got footage," she said, words tumbling. "Someone planted a scrambler on the feed and pulled private captures. They spliced it with a strategic overlay about contamination. The council is convening. Varun says it's likely a coordinated smear." "Who would smear the queen?" Javier asked, but the answer was already thin and obvious in the new light. Those who feared any change to the Lysari line. Those who saw a hybrid as an existential threat. Those human agencies that smelled opportunity in blurrier ethics. "They don't want her to destabilize the narrative," Reina said, "or to be vulnerable to human leverage." She paced, hands pulling at the edge of a vest as though she could stitch the worry into fabric. "Hale is here, talking to the Confederation liaisons. He says the agency recommends protective custody of involved parties until an inquiry completes. You know what that means." Javier did. Protective custody sounded like safety until you were the one locked in a sterile room with a cooling cup of mind tea and a team with clipboards deciding what your biology meant to politics. He had never been processed like a piece of cargo before, never stood under scrutiny that read his body as policy. The idea of being sequestered terrified him more than any rusted hull he'd had to replace. He tried to find Alara, thinking her presence would be an anchor. Instead, he found her the target of 1,000 polite and poisonous questions. Her attendants wrapped her in protocol, each advisor presenting options in tactical recipes, a public denial, a staged engagement, a medical review of her reproductive health. Alara listened, jaw clenched, and once in a while a flicker of the vulnerable woman from the gardens passed across her face, a ghost of the soft person who had asked Javier to be something risky. "You must step back," Varun urged at one point, as if caution could be varnished onto a soul. "Dissociate the personal from the political. Let the council perform its stabilizing function." Alara's reply was quiet and made the room tilt. "If I step back, I am not a queen," she said. "I am an instrument of fear." The council, predictably, chose ceremony over improvisation. They crafted a statement that read like a surgeon's list: concern for the sovereign's judgment, an insistence on an investigation, a veiled call for restraint. But in the underbelly of the statement were whispers that were more final. For the safety of both species, one commentary advised publicly, a moratorium on unofficial unions is necessary. It read like diplomacy, but functioned like prohibition. Then a dossier surfaced, not from the Lysari, but from a neutral research cell whose credibility was nebulous at best. Gene Integration Reports, The Hybrid Threat. It was a glossy packet of selective science, cherry-picked studies, and speculative diagrams that mapped the hypothetical child as an agent of disruption, fast learning, immunologically superior, a carrier of traits that could destabilize ecosystems or worse, military applications. The language was clinical and monstrous. Someone had labeled the unborn possibility a weaponized chimera in a graphic that made it onto every net in hours. Javier held the document like a mirror and saw his own face distorted. The dossier described him as genetically available and suggested surveillance protocols under the guise of consent for safety. It proposed, daintily, a set of solutions that involved institutional custody, gene banking, and, in an alarming footnote, directed studies that read to Javier like euphemism for control.
He went to Lara with the packet clenched in his hands. The rows of her advisors around her looked like a field of spears. She took the dossier, skimming with an expression that was not shock, but a confirmation of what she had feared from the beginning, that bureaucracies loved to turn intimacy into problem sets. For a beat, Javier saw the queen falter. The luminous hair around her face seemed to dull, the biolattice of her throne pulsing a bit slower. "They call us a danger when we try to be more alive," she said. "They would rather freeze us into histories and mythologies." "You're not thinking of stepping back," he said, voice thin. "You told me you'd stand between my people and anyone who would use them." "I will," she said. "But the law is a different animal from loyalty. There are ministries that will argue imprisonment as protection. There are human agencies that will argue gene flow monitoring is precaution. We cannot let their fear write our future." Outside the council chambers, pressure built like a storm front. Reina's loyalties were tested in small, cruel ways. Her team was offered contracts to relocate to Terra under protective auspices. One of them, Ortiz, accepted, citing family obligations. Reina remained, but the change in composition shifted the dynamics of trust. Javier watched friends and allies become calculation. The station itself, meant to be a neutral salvage post, seemed to warp into an arena where loyalty was currency and betrayal a possible commodity. The first betrayal came from a source he would never have expected, Varun. Javier had thought Varun's sharpness was policy, not personal. But when an encrypted message appeared on Javier's comm, one that should only have been accessible by close counsel, he recognized Varun's handwriting in the cadence. Varun had sent a copy of Lara's private garden conversation to a consortium of conservative counselors and human agency heads with the tag, "Evidence for Expedited Oversight." The message was framed not as concern, but as urgency, a ticking clock on the Queen's judgment. Varun had not merely advised, he had catalyzed the smear. Confronting him was worse than the discovery. Varun, when accused, did not flinch. "I did what stability demanded," he said, the translation coil smoothing his contempt into practicality. A queen's misstep cannot be rectified by sentiment. It must be forestalled by law. "By betraying someone who trusted you?" Javier spat. "By weaponizing intimacy into a dossier?" "The realm is safer this way," Varun said. "You will understand when you love rule more than risk." That line landed like a fist. Javier's world had been small enough that Varun's ideals felt barbaric on the human scale of meals and clanging engines. To Varun, sacrifice was a spindle of statecraft. To Javier, it was the slow erasure of someone he had begun to love. There was another treachery, more intimate and more final. Hale, the agency operative with a corporate smile, offered Javier an ultimatum wrapped like a courtesy. Agree to a monitored procedure that would allow for a safe reproductive plan under agency oversight, and his sister would be guaranteed a relocation package and protection.
Refuse, and bureaucratic friction would not need to be direct violence. Simple administrative suffocation could be enough. His sister's housing benefits could be audited, her permits delayed. Small penalties that would snowball. Capturing Javier's consent in ink would be cheaper than taking her. When Javier brought the offer to Elara, she looked as if something inside her had been shattered deliberately to show him the edges. "You cannot sign away your family for me," she said. "It is cowardice fronted as sacrifice." "I'm not signing anything," he answered, but the tremor in him betrayed how close he'd come to doing exactly that. The agency's language, protective custody, relocation, felt like velvet over a trapdoor. Elara's response was fierce and public. She called an address to the station and announced a temporary moratorium on private proceedings about the proposed union until an independent tribunal, including human representatives, could be convened. The council issued an outraged rebuke. Varun accused her of jeopardizing social order. Hale and other human officials hinted at necessary interventions. The station trembled between law and love, authority and heart. The friction fractured alliances. Some Lasari ministers withdrew their patronage, reluctant to ally their reputations with an experiment that mocked lineage. Some of Javier's human contacts urged him to accept agency offers as a pragmatic way to shield his family. Reina, her face a mask of pain, suggested he consider a private solution for his sister that would avoid the public eye. It felt like everyone had chosen a hand to fold his life into, and none of them agreed. In the midst of the spiral, Javier and Elara had their worst argument. It began with a quiet accusation. Him, furious that she would risk a tribunal. Her, furious that he would even consider agency strings as protection. Words climbed like sharp tools. "You put me on a pedestal and then use me as a shield," he said, voice ragged. "You promised to defend us with your authority, then you briefed committees and opened me to surgery and oversight." "I did not brief committees to betray you," she replied. "I briefed them because transparency is our only armor. You think secrecy will protect you? Look, secrecy is what allowed those who catalog us to make dossiers and whispers. Transparency got us a dossier calling our child a weapon," he shot back. "Doesn't that tell you something?" "It tells me we are not ready for cowardice masquerading as protection," she said. Her eyes glittered with hurt. "If you would have signed away your family's autonomy to an agency, you'd have already consented to being an instrument." "And you," he countered, "you use proclamations and tribunals like their shields. You can see that your crown makes everything you do political. If you declare a tribunal, you invite the cameras and the predators." Their anger was a physical thing, staking out space between them. The loyalty Javier had felt toward Elara, intense, nascent, frail, began to fracture under the world's apparatus. What had felt like an intimate rebellion now felt like a public spectacle with them on opposite sides. When the argument ended, it did so with no resolution. They walked apart in different directions, a silence like quarantine following them. The gardens felt colder without the small warmth of their proximity. The station, a neutral place for engineers and courtiers alike, adapted to the fracture. People chose their camps. A polite coldness replaced earlier curiosity. That night, Javier sat in the maintenance bay surrounded by tools that no longer offered solace. Each wrench, each calibrated gauge used to be a conversation rather than a jury. He realized with a slow, terrible clarity that their affair, if it could be called that, had grown into something that could hurt many people. His sister's name hovered in his head like a lit fuse. He loved Elara with a ragged earnestness that frightened him. He loved his sister by the kind of devotion that made him consider giving up everything to keep her safe. He understood now what the dossiers feared. The conflation of affection and policy made people dangerous and leaders unpredictable. But more than that, he saw how their love, however private its origins, had become a public battleground where rights, fears, and ambitions colluded. Secrets, once small and savory, had become corrosive. Fractures showed up not as earthquakes, but as hairline slips. Colleagues choosing offers, friends silenced by bargaining chips, a queen leaning on the law like a crutch. The fight to keep something alive had exposed the very parts of them that were most vulnerable: family, trust, freedom. In the dark, Javier made a decision. He would not willingly let his sister be a bargaining chip. He would not let agencies or councils define the terms of their intimacy. He would not sign his life into a glaze of oversight. But he also could not, at this point, walk away from Aylada. The choice was not between love and safety. It was between being passive and choosing what kind of courage he wanted to practice. He rose, hands steadying on a workbench, and for the first time since the gardens, he felt the outline of the thing he wanted to be. A man who repaired not only machines, but the breaches between people. A man who could refuse to be catalogued by others' fear. The road forward would mean confrontation, exposure, and likely loss. But the alternative, living small to avoid being used, felt like death. Outside, Lysati Station pulsed with 1,000 opinions. Inside, Javier picked up his tools. The fractures had opened, bleeding out secrets and judgments. He could not fix them alone, but he could try to stitch a beginning from the tattered ends. He would gather allies, tell honest stories, and risk exposure on his own terms. The choice had detonated their quiet. It would also be the place where truth, ugly and beautiful, would be forced to show itself. The tribunal convened under glass domes and the thin hum of cameras. Aylada walked in with the measured gait of someone who had learned to carry her people's expectations like a lit crucible. Javier followed with tools forgotten at the bay and a knot of resentment and resolve in his stomach. They were not called lovers in the formal docket, only parties of interest. But those words hardly contained the tidal force roiling behind their faces. The room smelled of disinfectant and citrus air filters, a sterile honesty that could not scrub out the way curiosity gnashed into cruelty. The presiding magistrate, a Lasari elder with filigreed scales at her temple, opened the session with the sort of gravity reserved for funerals and coronations. Cameras blinked. Human liaisons took notes like surgeons. Varun sat with his expression practiced into pallor. Halis' operative face was an exercise in neutrality. Around the edges, allied voices, diasporic Lasari thinkers, a few human rights advocates, Reina with her jaw clenched, formed a hesitant choir. The tribunal would decide whether the proposed union deserved oversight, secrecy, or outright prohibition. It would also, painfully and inevitably, decide whether a sovereign could place her personal desire where law had been written to hold safety above all. Aylada stepped forward and spoke for herself and for a future she had decided she wanted. Her voice, always controlled, trembled once, not from fear, but from bearing truth. "We are not a threat because we love," she said. "We are not weapons because we choose tenderness. My choice is my responsibility. It is not a secret to be litigated into compliance." She spoke with the clarity of someone accustomed to argument, and yet there was a tenderness that made the room tilt. Javier listened, hands curled into fists that didn't know whether to unclench. When it was his turn, he did not read a prepared statement. He rose with the awkward, honest cadence of a mechanic making an appeal to engines and, sooner or later, to people. "I fix things," he said simply. "I make things that are broken keep going. That doesn't make me clever in your laws. It does make me stubborn. I'm not a policy instrument. I'm someone's brother. If you want to talk credentials, talk to her about longevity in practice, because I've kept my sister alive in ways that don't show up in your dossiers. I'm not a lab rat. I'm a man who knows what it is to make promises and try to keep them." There was a murmur, some impressed, some offended. Varun's mouth thinned. Hale's eyes narrowed, like a tool being tested. But the statement had a shape Alara's rhetoric could not wholly mimic. It was small and human, and therefore resistant to containment. That night, the feeds erupted. Someone had leaked a private moment of Javier's testimony, a clip where he told a story about fixing a radio for his sister so she could hear the rain on Sol 3. The clip had no diagrams, no cold speculation, only a brother's voice that quieted 1,000 algorithmic anxieties. The public reaction shifted, almost imperceptibly, from fear to something complicated: empathy. It did not erase the dossiers or the council's fear, but it made the calculus messier. The backlash hardened into action. Conservative ministers proposed an emergency statute allowing for involuntary oversight of cross-species unions for the protection of biospheres. Human agency memos proposed standardized monitoring under the guise of medical ethics. When presented to Alara, those recommendations read like knives wrapped in velvet. The court demanded her acquiescence to a plan that would institutionalize surveillance. Prenatal gene banks, monitored gestation, restricted custody clauses. They promised safety in legalistic terms and threatened exile if she refused. Alara looked at Javier with a kind of fierce sorrow. "Will you let them make you into their study?" she asked. The question more than rhetoric. It was a plea for his autonomy. "Will you allow us to be sterilized into compliance?" "Isn't there a way to be safe without being caged?" Javier asked. The rage that had been simmering turned into a practical energy. "If they fear weaponization, let us invite peer review. Let us choose scientists we trust. No secrecy, no corralling, only oversight that we consent to, not constraints they impose." It was a small, radical demand, to insist on agency over their bodies and their narrative. For Alara, it felt like an escalation and a sanity check. For Varun and the council, it was destabilizing because it suggested the sovereign could limit the state's reach into intimacy. Hale and his operatives bristled because a consenting plan removed the easiest pathway to control. The next morning, a group of independent scientists, some Lysari, some human, some from neutral colonies, arrived in a press of legitimacy. They proposed a transparent protocol, open laboratories, public peer review, a charter ensuring parental rights and protections against institutional appropriation. It was slow and imperfect, but it offered a possibility that was neither secrecy nor coercion. It placed trust in the messy, communal work of science and ethics rather than in the blunt force of law. The council recoiled. Varun called the protocol naive. Conservative ministers predicted catastrophe. But the public, now stirred by Javier's small story and by a diaspora of scholars who had long argued for genetic diversity as resilience, began to push back. Demonstrations in neutral spaces, songs and banners that called for a child's right not to be a political number, made the council's arguments look small and mean. Petition signatures, media campaigns, and fierce op-eds communicated something the tribunals could not, that people could choose the kind of future they wanted. Pressure mounted in corridors and in intimate spaces. Hale delivered one last thinly veiled offer, secret monitoring in exchange for optimized protection for Javier's family. He framed it as generosity. Javier stared at the operative until something inside him hardened. "No," he said, "not like that." Alara, for all her sovereign steadiness, surprised herself and him. She convened a private session with her political opponents and with the human operatives. She stood up in front of them and, without the artifice of ceremony, declared a choice that shocked the room. She would accept the scientists' protocol publicly, under oath, and she would refuse any unilateral custody or surveillance that did not have mutual consent. If the council insisted on punitive measures, she would step down and allow the public to decide whether a queen who loved outside the lines should reign. The statement detonated across the station. Political allies gasped. Opponents laughed nervously. Varun called it abdication of duty. Alara's attendants whispered about scandal. But the act had the moral clarity of someone willing to make herself vulnerable for the principle she'd named, autonomy. In the days that followed, the movement to support them solidified into a fragile coalition. Scientists, human rights attorneys, artists, Lysari diaspora members, and unexpected allies in the council who feared the blowback of a crackdown. They organized, held hearings, and, importantly, countered every smear with stories of love and repair. Javier spoke publicly about his sister and about the small human labor of mending. Alara spoke honestly about lineage and fear and the audacity of choosing tenderness over preservation. The fiercest moment came when Varun, backed by a faction, attempted a procedural coup to declare their union a national risk. The motion would have effectively criminalized their choice. The vote was tense and razor-edged. Javier sat in the chamber like someone waiting for medical news. Alara's face was the only serene thing in a room full of rage. When the ballots were cast, enough councillors balked. The motion failed by the slimmest margin. The victory was not total. Damage had been done. Reputations shredded, alliances lost, families pushed into precariousness. Reina's team had splintered. Ortiz had left for Tierra. Varun retained a base of influence. Hale retreated, calculating the next possible move. But the failure of the coup meant the tribunal's harshest penalties would not be applied. The independent protocol would be allowed to begin, with public oversight and legal protections. What followed was not the end of danger, but the beginning of a new fight. One fought not with secrecy and leverage, but with witnesses and consent. Javier found himself thrust into speeches and panels, a greasy-handed mechanic talking about ethics of repair and the right to choose. Alara found her crown heavier in a different way, no longer simply an instrument of dynasty, but a symbol of risky compassion. They had both been stripped of illusions. What remained was a decision to stay and to be accountable. On the night the protocol was ratified, small fires of celebration bloomed across the station. Quiet dinners, low-slung music, toasts with a drink that tasted of citrus and the sea of stars. Javier and Alara sat at the edge of the gardens, hands wrapped around each other, exhausted and elated. They had not won without cost. The world around them was still a battleground. But they had chosen a way forward that refused the easy dominion of fear. "You could have left," Javier said, voice raw with exhaustion and something like longing. "None of us would have blamed you." "I could not," she replied. "I could not live knowing I had chosen safety over a life I might have wanted. That is a poor crown to wear." They kissed then, not like a coronation, but like a repair. Careful, necessary, full of the quiet labor of two people who had wrestled with the world and made a small, defiant pact. They would still be watched, still be argued about, still be the subject of dossiers and doctrine. But they had moved the axis a little. The tribunal's verdict had not birthed a child yet. It had birthed a precedent. That love could be claimed in public without being sterilized into a policy object. They had paid for it. Friends lost, reputation stained, threats that now lived like shadows at the periphery. But they had also made allies and opened doors that had long been shuttered. The act of reclamation was messy and finite and real. Outside, the stars continued their indifferent turning. Inside, Javier and Alara sat in the garden's diffused glow and breathed like people who had learned to hold gratitude and grief at once. The road to a child, to hybrid possibility, to a future that insisted upon both species' dignity would be long and dangerous. But for the first time since the queen had stepped down from her biolattice throne, they felt capable of facing it together. Broken, brave, and resolutely human. They woke to a station that felt less like a courtroom and more like an organism that had been stitched and was learning to breathe differently. The tribunal's protocols moved forward with agonizing bureaucratic slowness. Registered scientists, open labs, mutual consent clauses, legal protections for family ties. The threat of secret custody and unilateral surveillance receded into memos, then into the cautionary rhetoric of a losing faction. Varan kept his position and his bitterness. Hale withdrew to schemes that mattered less than the public will now gathering around the idea that love was not an asset to be audited. The immediate danger did not evaporate, but it became manageable, arguable, litigable, communal. Javier went back to the salvage bay and found his hands returning to their old grammar, tightening, calibrating, coaxing life out of reluctant metal. But the work now carried a new vocabulary. When he fixed a leaking valve, he thought of protections in legalese and of the scientist's hands that would someday touch a different kind of life with consent. Reina came back on roster, bruised but loyal. She brought news from Tierra, signatures, solidarity letters, quiet fund transfers, small, practical acts that felt like scaffolding.
Alara moved through the palace quarters with a steadier gait. She had lost patrons but gained others, thinkers who admired risk, citizens who recognized the audacity in choosing tenderness. She kept her crown for now, but she wore it with a different purpose, no longer only a symbol of ancestry, but a reminder of a promise she had made aloud to be accountable. Together, they drafted charters and visited labs, attended public forums and private dinners, learned to make political theater into education rather than spectacle. Their relationship settled into a rhythm not of secrecy, but of mundane intimacy under public light. They argued, sometimes loudly, over childcare philosophies, sleeping arrangements, and the logistics of dual-species nutrition. They negotiated visas and medical consent forms. Love, they discovered, was not exempt from forms. It simply refused to be reduced to them. The city, both human and Lysari, changed in small ways. A children's book published by a Lysari poet about two worlds learning to braid their songs. A repair workshop in a back alley that held a solidarity fundraiser. A counselor quietly retiring rather than be the architect of punitive policy. The worst of the smear campaigns faded as humans and Lysari encountered one another as neighbors rather than statistics. On a cool night months later, after agreements were inked and scientists took their oaths, Javier and Alara walked the gardens hand in hand. They paused by a pool where bioluminescent koi circled like living constellations. Alara tucked a stray curl behind his ear with fingers that smelled faintly of metal grease and palace incense. He rested his head against her shoulder and listened to the slow, contented hum of the station. No longer only an engine, but a home, breathing with the possibility of a child who would be neither weapon nor trophy. Only the proof that risk, when chosen together, can heal more than it breaks.